Hey everybody, it's Rabbit. Welcome back to the channel, and today we're going to be continuing our Worst Map Ever series by looking at the map Normandy in the game of War Thunder. And as with all of these guys, we're going to start with a little bit of trivia about the map itself. The map Normandy was originally introduced in 2015, so it's about 10 years old, which makes it one of the older maps currently in the game. That being said, when originally introduced, the map Normandy actually had a pretty substantial issue in that one of the capture points was on a hill on the south right-hand side of the map, and the other one was on the beach on the north left-hand side of the map. These were effectively friendly capture points. In other words, they were very easy for one side to capture, but as I'm sure you can imagine, having one side with their primary capture point on the high ground and another side with their primary capture point on the low ground led to some pretty obvious results, and the map was a little lopsided. Now, the current version of the Normandy map is actually two separate maps that are connected by a fairly prominent terrain feature. First, you have the regular map that's simply called Normandy, or we'll call it Beach for the remainder of this episode, and then you have the other map that's called Normandy Fields. Now, unlike the Sinai maps, where currently the Sinai maps, while they're technically right next to each other, they don't actually overlap anymore. In Normandy, they actually overlap at the point where there's a small village and also a little church on top of a hill. This position is somewhat relevant in both versions of game mode, so it will be familiar to you. Additionally, it's fairly easy to see the prominent Zeppelin hangar from Normandy Fields if you're on the Normandy Beach map. Both variants of the Normandy map would pretty firmly fall in the mid-size range, being around 1.5 to 2 kilometers square. While the Normandy Beach map actually fairly prominently features the standard 5 configurations, the 3 cap, the 2 cap, and then a single cap A, B, and C, Normandy Fields actually only has 2 variants. It has a 3 cap and a 2 cap, and it does not have any current single caps in rotation, although previously in the past there have been single caps, so it's not exactly out of the question that Gaijin could bring back some of the single caps for Normandy Fields in the future if they chose to do so. Since there are, for the most part, 2 different maps, we will actually split this into basically 2 sections. The first part of the video will be discussing Normandy Beach, and the second part will be discussing the Fields of Normandy. And looking at Normandy Fields, one of the first features we look at when we look at any map is how viable is it to take the enemy capture point in the 2 cap variant. And in this particular instance, the answer is not very. While both of the capture points do have some form of hard cover in the form of buildings and rubble, and even some fences that can potentially block line of sight, they are both essentially on the low ground on the road going on the outskirts of town, and both spawn points basically have one of the 2 spawn points that completely overlooks it. On top of that, the spawn points are pretty close to these capture points, and the capture points are also effectively pincered in between the north and south spawn points. So while you do have to watch for somebody coming from the high ground trying to shoot you, you also have to watch out for people coming from the low ground trying to flank you. It makes these pretty inviable to capture unless you basically already have full map control. So broadly speaking, if it's a 2 capture map on Normandy Beach, personally I would just settle in for the long haul and assume it will be a game of attrition. Looking at the capture points on Normandy Beach, and the first one we're going to look at is the A capture point. Now, the A capture point is somewhat weird in that it has really long stretches of open beach to actually get to the capture point itself. And because it has these really long stretches to get to the capture point itself, it's incredibly exposed and incredibly difficult to both get onto and off of. Frequently, one team will rush the cap and manage to get it in the opening few seconds of the map, and then for the remainder of the map, it will stay in their control unless the teams have whittled down enough to where it's actually viable to make a run for it. It really is one of the more annoying capture points to get onto and off of. However, once you're onto it, it does act as a bit of a soft power position because it can see a lot of approaches going from the main seawall onto the B capture point. So it can, in theory, be a bit of a soft power position, but realistically, people don't actually have to go that way. They often choose to, but it's not all that necessary. The B capture point is located squarely in the middle of the town, and really it doesn't have a lot of cover at all, and more annoyingly it's actually surrounded by trenches, which makes it one of the more tedious capture points to actually deal with because you can often get your vehicle hung up on these trenches and slow down your progress. The only real cover is actually the church itself, but this also creates another big issue because this main road going from C into the church can see all the way down into anybody that is on one of those positions. So not only do you have to watch out for enemies that might be coming from behind you in the seawall, you also have to watch out for enemies that are coming from C itself. It ultimately ends up being a very exposed position, and you really need a lot of assistance from your team to close off at least one of these lanes so you're not looking in basically every direction at once. Once you capture the point itself, your only real option is to push into the city or along the seawall because there's not really anywhere else to go. You could certainly try to go up to the sea point, but then you're crossing right across the enemy spawn point in a major movement lane, so that's pretty rough. The C capture point is located squarely on a cluster of buildings, and much like the A capture point, is kind of in a bit of a no man's land. There's a lot of open field around it, and not really a lot of cover leading up to it. The closest thing to really a viable approach is simply trying to silhouette yourself behind as many of the buildings on the C point as possible from enemies that are overlooking that position from their own respective spawn. It's not exactly a reliable strategy. Sometimes you can also approach up the road coming from B to C, and that is a little bit recessed, so it can provide you with some cover, but really not much. It is a pretty exposed position to get onto, and also generally a pretty exposed position to get off of as well. The only real saving grace to the C point is that in order for the enemy to peek over their own hill next to their spawn in order to shoot you, they have to expose themselves to your teammates peeking over your hill at your spawn. So sometimes your team can provide effective enough overwatch to make it viable, but it is still a pretty nervous prospect regardless. The movement lanes for Normandy Beach, however, end up being incredibly janky because there aren't exactly clear movement lanes. Most of the straight paths you can go from a spawn point to a capture zone are incredibly exposed, so individuals trying to do that will often find themselves met with incoming fire pretty quickly. It's a habit you will quickly get broken out of. Realistically, the movement lanes are basically just a box around the spawns and the seawall, and in this area you're going to see a lot of enemy activity. But if you go really far north or south of this area, either to the beach or out to the open fields, you're going to see a lot less players in these sort of flanking positions. This creates kind of an odd map flow because there basically is a giant corridor in the middle that's very densely occupied, and some areas in the north and south that are very sparsely occupied. So as far as power positions, we already kind of hit on this, but the A capture point can effectively be a soft power position, and what I mean by that is, while it does have good cover and it does have good vision, it's ultimately overlooking part of the map that is not really necessary in order to win the game. So it is one of those positions that while it can be really effective, it can also be kind of useless and also pretty difficult to get off of. Likewise, you will sometimes see people rush to the island in the top left-hand corner of the map. This position does have pretty good vision along the seawall and to approaches to A, but yet again, it's just not that actively traveled part of the map. If your team gains control of the beach pretty early, you're probably not going to do anything here, and more importantly, you are very exposed from anybody on the seawall, so if they see you trying to get out of that point, they're probably just going to shoot you. As far as the seawall itself, we've already kind of touched on this. It does have pretty good vision and pretty good cover from individuals that are down on the beach. Additionally, it has pretty good cover from itself because both sides have essentially a machine gun bunker that is sitting at the edge of their seawall that they can use to take cover, either from people on the beach or on people from the opposite seawall. This is one of those interesting annotations about the seawall though, because your positions on the seawall can see all the way across to enemy positions on the seawall. So taking a position on the seawall can often be a bit of a juggling act between trying to maintain some kind of observation or fire off of anybody that's trying to go flanking down the beach side, and also trying to contest opponents that are on the enemy seawall. Of course, the one position that both the seawalls lead to is actually the monument. Now, the big thing to note about the monument is the monument has excellent coverage. It can see all the way down to sea, it can see all the way across lanes going into town, and it can see across the seawall itself. But this is a bit of a double-edged sword. Much like with the seawall themselves, having a lot of line of sight is both a very good thing and a very bad thing. So while you can use the base of the monument to hide your hull, and even the monument itself to hide your turret from one of these directions, you can't hide it from the other two. So while this can be an incredibly powerful position, if your team is limiting the number of angles that you have to watch, it can also be a very vulnerable position if your team is not doing that. Moving into the town itself, and the town itself has a lot of these essentially soft power positions using piles of rubble that can allow tanks to go hold down, hide parts of their hull, or even extreme cases hide their entire hull and parts of their turret. These are essentially World of Tanks style obstacles. World of Tanks does this a lot with their maps where they put these piles of rubble everywhere so that hull down vehicles can always have an advantage. It kind of annoys me in those games, and honestly it's not really that great here because all it does is make the movement lanes feel more congested, but you can use them as effective power positions if you're a tank that has very small weak points that are mostly on your hull. Moving further south into the fields themselves, and there is this one bomb crater right between B and C, and this is a really effective position if you're coming from the left-hand spawn, because if you're coming from the left-hand spawn, you can actually use this bomb crater to see basically all of the approaches from the right-hand spawn to C, and all of the approaches that they have on the road itself, and even part of B is pretty easily visible from your position. So it's an excellent position if you can get to it quickly, but it is often kind of difficult to get to without getting spotted out or taken out. Of course, as I'm guessing most people have experienced, the southern spawns do have hills conveniently located basically right outside of their spawn that can overlook the entire area around C, which can somewhat restrict the movement in the open fields aspect of this map. These positions are pretty easy to get to, and honestly, in my opinion, pretty self-explanatory. They overwatch part of the map with a capture point, and they have pretty good cover. The last position we're going to look at is actually a position that is pretty annoying to get to unless you know a specific route. If you're on the right-hand spawn and you go basically all the way south and then all the way to the left, you're going to eventually arrive at the church, and the only way to do this without exposing yourself to an excessive amount of fire is to essentially redline, that is to say exactly on the map boundary, or even go a little bit off of it at times, because there is actually a pretty good line of sight to all of the major routes you could take to this position from the left-hand spawn. However, if you can get to this church right here, you actually have excellent vision over the C point, you have excellent vision over some of the paths going through the middle of the map. Additionally, you even have some cutoff ability for tanks going from either spawn to B, and you could even see the left-hand south spawn pretty easily. It's one of those really good positions, but it's also often kind of annoying to get to. So as far as overall strategies, I feel like Normandy often ends up being one of the more self-explanatory maps, because as we went into, in terms of the town itself and the seawall, you have great positions where you can hide parts of your hull and even parts of your turret in specific situations, and you can also brawl it out pretty effectively at closer ranges, so heavier tanks tend to like this middle part of the map. However, as you also probably saw, there are quite a few long-range positions that tank destroyers with really effective guns can use, either outside of the southern spawns or even along the seawall itself, where they can basically make their long range and powerful guns felt. Additionally, as you can also probably assume by some of the other positions I pointed out, there are quite a few rat positions where if you have a small, light, annoying fast tank, you can go into positions like the church, the bomb crater, or you can go into positions around A to just try and annoy the enemy team. It's the type of map where in terms of the general strategies for the map itself, people tend to struggle more with the execution than with the concept. It's not that much of a stretch to say, I have a light fast vehicle, I don't want to be in these really confined city streets where I can run into a heavy tank head on. And conversely, if you're in something like a big heavy tank with a lot of armor and a powerful gun, being stuck in the open where you can be shot from a bunch of different angles is less ideal than being able to brawl it out in the middle of a city. So a lot of the execution about doing well on Normandy Beach is less about understanding the broad strokes of what you should be doing and more about the specifics of being aware enough of your surroundings to know what will be useful in any one given situation. As far as the single cap A variant, this tends to be one of the more annoying variants of this particular map to play because it's incredibly difficult to get both onto and off of this point, even more so in this variant because it's the only point anybody is looking at. Controlling the seawall and controlling the town itself is very important to being able to take this capture point and hold it for any extended period of time. With that being said, I would not underestimate flanks to the south, because flanks to the south can be very efficient at drawing enemy resources away from the capture point and also cutting off reinforcements going into the city. The single cap B variant tends to play much like a normal map just because this is largely where the main corridor for movement and activity was anyway, so generally speaking most of your strategies that worked on the normal 3 cap variant of this map will also work on single cap B. In the single cap C variant, the map tends to play a little differently because both the city itself, the seawall, and also the beach tend to be a lot less active than they are normally, making the city from a major movement lane into more of a flanking route. So it is important to keep an eye on the north side of the map and also consider the north side of the map as a potential opportunity to flank alongside the enemy team. That being said, the normal flank routes to the south in this particular variant actually end up being a lot more active than they normally are just because it's flanking essentially the only capture point, so you have to be a lot more cautious if you're trying to use the southern flank going by the small village and the church. As far as my overall thoughts on Normandy Beach, personally I think it's one of the better maps in the game because it provides a nice variety in terms of overall options and the play experience. playstyles such as sniping, brawling, and flanking are generally pretty viable. There are some minor spawn camping issues, but honestly I think they're pretty minor all things considered, and the map on the whole does tend to play pretty well, especially compared to some of the other maps in the game. While I'd hesitate to say it's one of my favorite maps, it is a map that has a generally good map flow, and I have had a lot of good games on it. And when I say I've had good games, it doesn't just mean games where I've won, it means games that were really close and really tense and really exciting basically all the way up to the end. And for me, if you're having a bunch of really close games on a map, that map is generally a pretty solid map. Moving on to Fields of Normandy, and as is the tradition, we first look at the 2 capture map to see how viable a zone cap is, and honestly on Fields of Normandy it's actually pretty viable. While you will be technically sandwiched between both spawns, it is actually a bit of a drive to get there, and you have pretty good vision on all of the available approaches that the other team can use, on top of the fact that both of the capture points have a decent amount of cover in terms of a cluster of buildings around them, so there are a wide variety of places that you could theoretically be if somebody is trying to skirt the outskirts of the capture point to try and pick you off before going in. On top of that, the capture points also tend to have enough places you could be that it's often difficult for aircraft to pick out your exact location. It's not to say they provide complete cover against aircraft, obviously, but they provide enough to where you're not guaranteed to simply get bombed off of it once you start capping it. I still don't think it's that viable just because of how much ground you have to cover in essentially open fields to actually get to them in order to even begin the capture point process, but it's not the worst, and I have seen captures come out from under a team's nose more than once. In terms of the more normal capture point, the A capture point is in the middle of a small village, and the issue with this particular capture point is that while you are driving to that village, you are very susceptible to hostile fire. You essentially have to consciously put effort to silhouette yourself behind one of the buildings in the village to protect yourself from hostiles that may actually be watching that capture point. So this is one of the biggest issues with A, is just getting onto the point without getting shot, even though technically you are approaching from the opposite side, which normally provides some degree of cover. Once you're on the capture point itself, because it is in a bit of a depression, you do have some lower elevation you can use to try and hide your vehicle, gain information, etc. The problem is once you take A, where do you go? You have another long field to get to the enemy spawn, but then you also have a pretty open run to try and get to B as well. It feels like once you take A, you just kind of back off or you go towards B. It's a bit of an island if I'm being honest. The B capture point for Fields of Normandy, however, I believe holds the distinction of being the single largest capture point in the entire game. Not only does it encompass the Zeppelin hangar itself, but it also encompasses a very large area around it, including assorted buildings and even parts of the fields on the outside. This, in my opinion, makes this one of the most annoying capture points in the entire game to try and get an enemy off of, because the enemy can quite literally be hundreds of meters away behind a building and contesting the capture point. So even if you have pretty good audio cues, it's often difficult to hear where the enemy on the capture point even is, because it's just such a big capture point. With that being said, once you do take the B capture point, you actually have a decent amount of options to get off of the B capture point or provide overwatch covering both the A and C capture point, so it at least gives you something to do once you take it, but the act of taking it can often be a knockdown drag-out fight because it's so easy for the enemy to contest it. The C capture point, much like the A capture point, is a small cluster of buildings surrounded by a sunken road, and one major redeeming feature about the C capture point the A capture point doesn't quite have is that the C capture point is on a very slightly higher elevation than the 2 spawn points, so you don't have to worry as much about getting shot while you're approaching it, although that will definitely still happen. More often than not, your issue is going to be once you get to the C capture point trying to get the enemy off of it. So it turns out with the C capture point, quite often the enemy will be literally on the opposite side, on the other side of the building, and if you try to go for them, you'll often get shot by their teammates. That's the biggest issue with the C capture point and trying to take it away from an enemy, is it's very easy for their teammates to essentially watch their backs. Once you take the C capture point, it's a lot like the A capture point. Your options are a little limited. I don't think they're as bad as A, but you still have a drive across some pretty open ground to get to B, or you can just try to spawn stuff them. It's generally not a great scenario to be in. Fields of Normandy on the whole also tends to have some pretty wonky movement lanes because essentially you go from spawn to spawn because in between those two spawns is a capture point, and then you also go from those capture points up into the middle in B. So what you essentially get is kind of a T-shaped movement lane. So as long as you're out of that T-shaped lane, you can often spot a lot of activity going towards that lane. While there are occasionally people that go directly towards B, that is incredibly sporadic and actually pretty uncommon. You will usually meet one or two enemies fighting you at B for that capture point, but most of them will be either be coming from the A point or from the C point, not coming directly from spawn. As far as power positions, the first power position I want to discuss is basically just reiterating that the church in the middle of the town on A is actually still a power position on this particular map. Only this time it's kind of a power position for the left-hand spawn. It's a lot harder for the right-hand spawn to get to it, although if the right-hand spawn can get to it, they can still use it pretty effectively. The other thing that's important to remember, obviously, is because now you have to watch the south instead of the north because that's where the rest of the map is, but generally speaking, it is still a very strong position. Another very interesting position that is kind of quirky and somewhat hard to use, but sometimes you can use it efficiently, is the area immediately behind the top left-hand spawn. This little hill behind the top left-hand spawn, you've probably seen somebody use it once or twice. You can just barely stay inside the map boundary while providing yourself with ample cover from hostile fire, and you can cover the entire area around the enemy north spawn. So this gives you a lot of area to cover the A and B positions pretty efficiently, especially if you have a good long-range gun or something like a laser rangefinder. The biggest drawback to this position is that while you're trying to drive up to it, you are essentially driving across open ground with no cover, so you are very vulnerable, which means this position is incredibly hard to use unless you're very early in the match, or unless the enemy team has been considerably whittled down. Of course, this also neatly segues into one of my favorite power positions on this map, and this is the various sunken roads. The sunken roads are low enough that they often conceal most, if not all, of your hull, and often large parts of your turret as well. This can make it a little annoying if you're in a shorter vehicle because it's sometimes difficult to see over them and actually get good lines of sight, but it is a really efficient position to hide a lot of your vehicle while also getting generally good vision. This also creates another interesting quirk of how the cameras work in the game, in that if you're at basically ground level looking at somebody coming towards you, you can see them very clearly because you're basically seeing under the bushes, whereas if somebody's coming towards you, they're now contending with the bushes more at eye level. So if you're in one of these sunken roads, it is often much easier to spot somebody coming towards you than it is for them to spot you, and it's also much easier for you to engage them in turn. As for how Fields of Normandy tends to play, the biggest trap in Fields of Normandy is that if you're on the left-hand side, by default it will spawn you in the north spawn. The north spawn is almost impossible to get out of if the enemy controls the A capture point. If you try to go south, you're essentially going uphill across a lot of exposed ground, and you often just get shot in the flank while you're trying to do so, but trying to just push outside of your spawn, you'll start getting shot from both church and the A point basically right away. The north left-hand spawn is probably one of the worst spawn traps on this entire map, and on really any Normandy map on the whole. It's just very easy for the enemy to control it from a very long distance out, which is part of the reason why this map feels pretty lopsided much of the time, is just because the left-hand spawn's primary spawn that you go to by default most of the time is actually a bit rough to get out of if your team ever gets put on the back foot. The top right-hand spawn is nowhere near as bad because it can often still go south and still make some push plays towards B, even if the enemy controls the A capture point and controls the church. So generally speaking, while the right-hand spawn can often afford to give up the A capture point and not be in too bad of a state, if the left-hand spawn ever gives up the A capture point, they're probably going to lose. It's very difficult to push back onto the A capture point and get enough space to actually do something meaningful on the map from that specific spawn point, and of course that is the default spawn point, so a lot of players that aren't really putting that much thought into how they play are just going to be spawning from there and then running headfirst into the enemy's guns. With that being said, the rest of the map is actually reasonably well balanced. There's actually enough terrain in terms of elevations and depressions to allow you to keep a vehicle at least somewhat hidden or not fully exposed, and when you combine that with rows of bushes that can make landing precise shots against your relatively small silhouette more difficult, it can allow for at least some facet of movement on the map. Additionally, there is some room for brawling both on the A point and the C point for more heavily armored opponents. With that being said, I do find slower moving tanks tend to be some of the least effective on this map, because by the time they get anywhere, often the entire situation has completely changed. It's very common for the B cap and the C cap to change hands several times over the course of a map on Fields of Normandy, and this means that slower tanks are at a bit of a disadvantage because by the time you arrive at a capture point, it's either already been secured and your team has already moved out, or the enemy has possession of it and you're about to get surrounded and taken out. It just makes for some very awkward scenarios if you're in a slower vehicle, even though there are some places they can play. Really, Fields of Normandy tends to heavily favor things like medium tanks and light tanks, with some emphasis on tank destroyers for holding down certain sightlines. As for my overall thoughts on Fields of Normandy, I honestly think the top left-hand spawn is the biggest Achilles heel to this map. The top right-hand spawn is nowhere near as bad and still has a lot of options even if the enemy is pushed to and through the A capture point. If something was done to kind of fix the top left-hand spawn, and I would like to emphasize, something has already been done about it. It actually used to be worse. But if they could really fix the top left-hand spawn to be a little bit more viable, even if the enemy controls the A capture point, I think this map would really be on the high end in terms of how well it plays, at least for tanks that are more mobile. It's a map that is deceptively complicated. It looks somewhat simple when you're just looking at an aerial view because there's only a handful of buildings and there's a lot of open fields. But the rows of bushes, the subtle differences in elevation and depression, and also the sunken roads provide a lot of interesting opportunities to both keep yourself hidden, surprise opponents, or even push up further on the map to try and take points. In my opinion, this map is actually a lot more interesting than it looks like on paper, and I find it plays quite well, especially if you're a player that likes to do a lot of moving. If you're a player that likes to just sit there and have the enemy run in front of your guns, maybe not the best, although there are parts around A where you can kind of do that. With that being said, the same thing that is Fields of Normandy's strength is also kind of its weakness, because it is very easy for enemies to just seemingly come out of nowhere and shoot you in the side, and obviously that can make for a bit of a frustrating experience. But for all of the frustration that you can sometimes have on this particular map, I do actually somewhat like it. Again, not really my favorite, but I do think it plays well enough at most battle ratings that it is a pretty solid map. And that wraps up our video. Feel free to let me know in the comments down below what you think of the Normandy maps, both Normandy Beach and the Fields of Normandy. I always love to hear from you guys. If you liked the video, like and subscribe always helps out the channel. As always, danke bitte, tschüss.